The wind on the high prairie was a constant, mournful presence, scraping across the dry grass and rattling the loose clapboards of the small, solitary ranch house. Thomas Calloway had lived with that sound for 5 years, ever since Sarah died. 5 years of wind and silence, broken only by the lowing of his small herd and the creak of saddle leather. Grief had settled on him like the dust, fine and pervasive, coating everything, dulling the edges of the world. He moved through his days in a rhythm dictated by necessity, tending the cattle, mending fences, making solitary meals over a low fire. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, a place he avoided as much as possible. Its inhabitants were either pitying or suspicious, neither of which he could tolerate. He preferred the company of the land itself, harsh and indifferent, mirroring his own state. His hands, thick and calloused, knew the feel of rope, wood, and steel better than they remembered the softness of a woman's skin. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes from squinting into the sun, and etched with a deeper sorrow around the mouth. He was only 35, but felt ancient, burdened by a loneliness that stretched wider than the plains around him. People said grief faded, like boot prints in the dust. Thomas had found that wasn't true. It didn't fade. It simply became part of the ground you walked on, shifting beneath your feet, always there. He had built walls around himself, higher and thicker than any fence he'd ever mended, not against the world, but against the possibility of ever feeling that kind of pain again. He existed, he didn't live. The ranch was his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could keep the world out and his memories locked in. The landscape itself was a test. Summers were brutal, the sun a hammer on the skull, the earth cracking into 1,000 dry veins. Winters descended with a ferocity that could kill livestock and freeze a man solid in his own cabin if he wasn't careful. Rattlesnakes coiled in the sparse shade, and coyotes sang their hungry songs at night, their cries sounding like lost souls. Survival out here wasn't a given, it was an earned state, paid for with sweat, vigilance, and a deep understanding of the land's unforgiving moods. Thomas had paid his dues, etched them onto his soul, becoming as much a part of the harsh beauty as the gnarled mesquite and the distant, impassive mountains. One late afternoon, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, casting long, distorted shadows, Thomas was riding the southern fence line. A storm was brewing on the horizon, low and dark, promising a sudden, violent downpour. He saw movement near a small arroyo, something huddled against the rising wind. His first thought was a lost calf, but as he got closer, his gut tightened. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, small and still, partially concealed by the dry brush. He dismounted cautiously, rifle loose in his hands, scanning the empty land around him. The wind whipped strands of his hair across his face, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Approaching slowly, he saw it was a young woman. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt and blood, and her arm was bent at an unnatural angle. She lay curled defensively, her breath shallow, a low moan escaping her lips as the wind buffeted her. She was Apache. Her dark hair was unbound, tangled with twigs and dust. On the left side of her face, stretching from her temple down across her cheekbone, was a network of intricate, almost geometric scarring, stark against her skin, giving her face a striking, almost fierce asymmetry. His initial caution warred with a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: concern. This wasn't hostile territory he'd stumbled into, this was his land, and she was clearly in trouble. He knelt slowly, speaking softly. "Hey, you all right?" Her eyes, dark and wide with pain and fear, flew open. She flinched violently at the sound of his voice, trying to scramble away despite her injuries. A small, crude knife lay clutched in her uninjured hand. She held it up weakly, a futile gesture of defense. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low, extending his empty hands, palms out. "I'm not gonna hurt you. You're injured." She didn't understand his words, that was clear, but she understood his posture. Still, she was wary, her gaze flicking between him and the vast, empty space behind him. Her breathing hitched, ragged with pain. Her arm was definitely broken, and likely a few ribs too, judging by the way she held herself. Dehydration was also a risk, her lips were cracked and dry. Leaving her there wasn't an option, not with the storm coming. Leaving her was unthinkable. His decency, buried deep beneath layers of grief and solitude, stirred to life. "I need to help you," he said, speaking slowly, using gestures pointing to her arm, then towards his ranch house in the distance. "Shelter, medicine." She watched him, eyes narrowed, the fear still prominent, but a flicker of desperate need seemed to cross her face. She was clearly in agony. He pointed to her knife. She hesitated, then, with immense reluctance, let it fall. "All right," he said, standing slowly. "This is gonna hurt. I need to carry you." He moved carefully, trying not to startle her further. He gently picked her up, supporting her injured arm as best he could. She cried out, a sharp, small sound, and went rigid in his arms, her body tense with pain and residual fear. She was lighter than she looked, frail beneath the torn clothing. He mounted his horse, holding her awkwardly but securely against his chest. The ride back to the ranch house was slow and bumpy, the wind now howling, beginning to spit the first heavy drops of rain. He felt the tremor of her body against his, a fragile bird in a storm. Reaching the small cabin felt like an achievement. The wind tore at the door as he fumbled with the latch, carrying her inside into the relative gloom. He set her down gently on the narrow cot near the fireplace. She curled in on herself again, shivering, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings with intense caution. The cabin was sparse: a cot, a rough-hewn table, a couple of chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves with supplies. It held the lingering scent of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. He busied himself building a fire, the dry kindling catching quickly, casting warm light and chasing away the chill. The sound of the wind outside escalated, a mournful wail that seemed to penetrate the thick log walls. He needed to assess her injuries properly, but didn't want to scare her more. He fetched a clean cloth and a basin of water, setting it near the cot. He knelt again, motioning to her face. "Let me clean this." She watched him, wary, but didn't resist as he gently wiped away the dirt and blood, revealing the full extent of her facial scarring. It wasn't fresh. It looked old, healed, but deeply marked. He didn't flinch or stare. He saw the fear in her eyes, the lines of pain around her mouth. He saw a person hurting. He moved carefully to her injured arm, his touch hesitant but firm. Examining it confirmed his suspicion, a clean break in the forearm. This wasn't something he could ignore. He'd set his own broken ribs once, and helped a neighbor set a dislocated shoulder, but a broken arm required care and splinting. He went to his supplies, gathering clean rags, some softer cloth for padding, and 2 thin, straight pieces of wood he used for patching fences. He returned to the cot, explaining with gestures what he needed to do. She seemed to understand, her gaze fixed on the wood and cloth. Fear tightened her features. "It's going to hurt," he repeated, his voice rough but steady. "I'll be as quick as I can." He worked efficiently, drawing on instinct and necessity. He gently straightened the arm, eliciting a sharp gasp of pain from her. She bit her lip, tears pooling in her eyes, but she didn't cry out again, only watched him with a fierce, silent endurance. He patted the wood and carefully bound it to her arm with the cloth, immobilizing the break. When he finished, he tied the arm across her chest with a wider strip of cloth, creating a makeshift sling. She sagged back onto the cot, exhausted and in pain, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, a slight easing of the tension in her jaw. She looked at the splinted arm, then back at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes. He got up, went to the small larder, and brought back some dried meat and a canteen of water. He offered them to her. She took the canteen first, drinking slowly, her throat working visibly. Then, tentatively, she took the dried meat, eating small, measured bites, watching him the entire time. He pulled a chair near the fire, giving her space. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the continued roar of the storm outside. He watched her, this unexpected injured stranger in his solitary world. She was vulnerable, clearly in distress, and he had offered help. Now, the question was what came next. Where had she come from? Why was she alone? The scarring on her face, did it mean something? He knew enough of the Apache to know markings could be significant. Was she outcast? Escaped? The possibility of trouble hovered in the air, but looking at her, small and hurt on his cot, he couldn't regret bringing her in. Not yet, anyway. Days blurred into a quiet, watchful routine. The storm passed, leaving the land clean and sharp under a vast blue sky, but the woman remained. Her arm was set, splinted tight, and slowly healing. She was still wary, silent mostly, speaking only in a few soft Apache words or broken gestures. Thomas learned her name was Nahili. He said his was Thomas. The sounds were strange and new to her. She stayed on the cot for the first few days, healing. He brought her food and water, checked her arm, changed the dressing on a gash on her leg. He moved slowly, deliberately, always letting her see his hands, never making sudden movements. He felt her eyes on him constantly, observing, assessing. He did the same to her. Her facial scarring was prominent, intricate. He wondered about its origin, but didn't ask. It was a part of her, like the curve of her brow or the quiet strength in her gaze, even when she was weakened. He saw no malevolence in her, only a deep well of sadness and a fierce, quiet resilience. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to move more. She would sit up, her eyes following him as he went about his tasks in the cabin. Then she started to get off the cot, moving stiffly at first, testing her weight on her injured leg. She began to help in small ways. She would fold the blankets neatly, sweep the dirt floor with a brush broom he used. She moved with a quiet grace despite her injuries, her presence a soft counterpoint to his own rough edges. The silence between them began to shift. It was no longer just empty or tense. Sometimes it felt watchful, sometimes shared. They ate meals together, sitting across the rough table. There was no conversation, just the clinking of tin plates and the sounds of chewing. But sitting together, facing each other, sharing the simple act of eating, it was a small bridge across the vast divide of culture and circumstance. One evening, sitting by the fire as dusk deepened, Thomas was cleaning his rifle. Nahili was sitting on the cot watching the flames. He felt her gaze shift to him. She spoke, her voice soft, hesitant. "Ran away." He paused, looking at her. Her English was halting, piecemeal. He tried to understand. "You ran away?" She nodded, her dark eyes shadowed. She touched the scarring on her face. "Bad," they said. "Bad sign. Banished." It took a moment for the meaning to sink in. The scarring wasn't a mark of honor or tribal identity, but something that had led to her being cast out, banished. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of rejection. Prejudice wasn't just something the white world practiced. It could exist anywhere, based on fear and misunderstanding. He looked at her face, at the delicate strength in her features despite the harsh markings. "Bad sign?" She looked like a survivor. He nodded slowly. "I see." He didn't push for more details. Her willingness to share even that much felt significant. In return, perhaps prompted by her quiet vulnerability, he found himself speaking, something he rarely did about himself. "My wife, Sarah, she died." "Sickness." He gestured vaguely towards the land, the empty space. 5 years, just me now." She listened, her gaze steady and understanding. She didn't offer platitudes or pity. She simply nodded, a small gesture that conveyed worlds of shared understanding about loss and solitude. She knew what it was to be alone, cast out from the warmth of human connection. In that quiet moment, sitting by the fire, the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unspoken empathy, a fragile thread weaving them together. As she grew stronger, her movements became less constrained. She could use her injured arm a little, carefully, holding things steady while using her good hand. She helped him with the chores outside, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, even helping him mend a section of fence, holding the wire taut while he hammered in staples with his good hand. Her presence on the ranch shifted something. It wasn't just his lonely outpost anymore. There was another heartbeat here, another rhythm. She learned a few more English words, picking them up quickly. Sun, water, horse, cow, fire, house, eat, sleep. He learned a few Apache words from her. Azdan, woman, Hashkan, Yuka, common in the area, Biki, thank you. Their communication remained minimal, a blend of broken language, gestures, and shared understanding that grew with each shared sunrise and sunset. He noticed small things, the way she watched the hawks circle overhead, a deep, primal connection to the land he'd only ever observed from a distance. The quiet reverence with which she handled the plants around the ranch, understanding their uses for food or medicine in a way he never had. She showed him how to make a poultice from a specific root for his aching knee. It worked better than anything he'd tried. He saw her strength wasn't just physical endurance, it was a quiet knowing, a deep resilience rooted in connection to the natural world. He, in turn, showed her the practicalities of his world. How to load a rifle, how to tell the weather by the clouds, how to mend tack. He taught her the names of things in English, and she repeated them carefully, her accent soft and unfamiliar. They were two people from different worlds, brought together by chance and hardship, finding a hesitant common ground in shared tasks and quiet mutual respect. The prejudices of the outside world seemed a distant echo, yet Thomas knew they were never truly far. His ranch was remote, but not invisible. And Nahili's presence, unmistakable with her striking face, was a challenge to the established order, an order that dictated who belonged where and with whom. One dusty afternoon, as Thomas was checking the cattle further out, he saw riders approaching. There were 4 of them, hard-looking men he recognized from the small, rough settlement about a day's ride south. Brody was at the front, a man with a mean streak and eyes that held no kindness. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. They weren't just passing by. He rode back to the ranch at a faster pace. Nahili was outside, feeding the chickens. She saw the riders too, her body tensing, her gaze fixed on the approaching figures. She looked at Thomas, a question and a fear in her eyes. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lock the door." She hesitated, looking at the men, then at him. He saw her fear, but also that same quiet strength he'd come to recognize. Still, she didn't argue. She went inside, the door closing firmly behind her. Thomas dismounted near the porch, standing between the approaching riders and the cabin, his rifle held casually in his hand. Brody and his men reined in a few yards away, dust swirling around them. Their eyes swept over Thomas, then lingered on the cabin. Brody grinned, a cold, unpleasant expression. "Well now, Calloway," Brody drawled, his voice rough. "Heard you got yourself a visitor." Thomas kept his face expressionless. "Just passing through. Injured." "Injured, huh?" One of the other men spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Heard it was a squaw, Apache." Thomas didn't confirm or deny. "She's hurt. Needed help." Brody's grin widened, losing any pretense of friendliness. "Help, huh? Or something else? Don't hold with consortin' with savages, Calloway. Especially not one with markings." He gestured towards the cabin door, his eyes flicking towards Thomas's face, hinting at an unspoken judgment. "Might be cursed. Might bring trouble." The word echoed Nahili's own explanation. Bad sign. Banished. Here, it was twisted into an excuse for cruelty and prejudice. Thomas felt a slow, steady anger begin to build, colder and harder than his grief had ever been. They weren't just judging her, they were judging him, seeing him through the same narrow, fearful lens. "She ain't bringin' trouble," Thomas said, his voice low and steady. "Just needs to heal." "That ain't for you to decide," Brody snapped, his tone turning hard. "Injured or not, she's Apache. Don't belong on white man's land, especially not with a white man. Hand her over, Calloway. We'll take her back where she belongs, or deal with her proper." The implication hung heavy in the air, a threat of violence. Thomas shifted his weight slightly, the rifle feeling solid in his hands. He met Brody's gaze directly. "She's under my roof, and that makes her my responsibility. You ride on now, Brody. Ain't nothin' for you here." Brody's eyes narrowed to slits. "You ain't got the say, Calloway. We got folks in town worried about you, about what you're keepin' here. Maybe we oughta just come take a look." He started to urge his horse forward. "I said ride on." Thomas raised the rifle, bringing it to bear, the barrel steady. His voice remained low, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Last chance." The air crackled with tension. The other men shifted nervously. They knew Thomas was quiet, isolated, but they also knew he was capable. Brody glared, his face contorted with anger and surprise. He hadn't expected Thomas to stand his ground like this, not for an Apache woman, not for anyone. "You're making a mistake, Calloway," Brody snarled. "This ain't over, the town won't stand for this." "That's my problem," Thomas replied. "Not yours, get off my land." After another long, tense moment, Brody hesitated, then grudgingly reined his horse back. He shot Thomas one last, venomous look. "We'll be back," he vowed, though the bluster rang a little hollow. "You hear me? We'll be back, and there'll be more of us." Brody turned his horse and led his men away, riding back the way they came, disappearing back into the dust haze. Thomas stood there for a long time, watching them go, the rifle still in his hands. His heart was pounding, a heavy drumbeat against his ribs. He hadn't fired a shot, but the confrontation felt like a battle won, or at least, a battle survived. He hadn't hesitated. The choice had been stark: protect the vulnerable life he had taken in, or fold to fear and prejudice. He had chosen. He lowered the rifle slowly, the tension draining from his body, leaving him shaky. He turned and walked towards the cabin door. As he reached it, the door opened slowly, and Nahili stood there, her eyes wide, her face pale beneath the scarring. She had obviously been listening. She looked at him, her gaze searching, filled with a mixture of fear for the danger he had faced, and something else, something akin to awe and disbelief. He had faced down his own kind, risking his safety, his life, for her. He met her gaze, offering a small, tired smile. "They're gone." She stepped towards him, reaching out her good hand tentatively. She touched his arm, her fingers light and hesitant. "Why?" she whispered, her English soft and fragile. "Why you fight?" He looked down at her, at the deep, quiet strength in her eyes, at the marks on her face that others called ugly or bad. He thought of Sarah, of the emptiness she had left behind. He thought of his own solitude, his resignation. And he looked at Nahili, a woman cast out, vulnerable, but alive and real. "Didn't feel right," he said simply, "leaving you to them." He didn't say that seeing the naked prejudice in Brody's eyes had made him see Nahili not as an Apache, not as a squaw with markings, but simply as Nahili, a person he had brought into his home, a person who had shown him quiet strength and unexpected empathy, a person who no longer deserved to be alone and hunted. He didn't say that protecting her felt like the first truly right thing he had done in years. He didn't say that her presence, however dangerous, had chipped away at the walls around his heart, letting in something fragile and unfamiliar, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, a connection that eased the gnawing ache of his grief. His hand, still holding the rifle, moved to cover hers on his arm. It was a clumsy gesture, awkward, but it was also a promise, a silent declaration. She didn't pull away. Her fingers tightened slightly on his sleeve. "Come inside," he said, his voice softer now. "Need to make sure that arm's still okay after all that." He stepped aside, letting her enter the cabin first. As she passed him, she paused, looking up at him. Then, slowly, a small, genuine smile touched her lips, transforming her face, softening the intensity of the scarring. It was the first real smile he had seen from her. It felt like the sun breaking through storm clouds. The threat from Brody and the others lingered, a shadow on the horizon, but for now, it had been pushed back. The confrontation had been the turning point, the crucible that had forged something new between Thomas and Nahili. There was no turning back for either of them. Thomas had made his choice, openly defying the societal prejudice that ruled the land. Nahili had found an unexpected protector, a place of fragile safety in a world that had cast her out. In the days and weeks that followed, the bond between them deepened, quietly, steadily. They were no longer just protector and protected, rescuer and rescued. They were two people who had found something essential in each other. The silences remained, but they were comfortable now, filled with mutual understanding and the easy rhythm of shared life. Their broken language grew, a patchwork of English and Apache, gestures and expressions. They talked about small things, the weather, the state of the cattle, the tasks for the day. And sometimes, they talked about bigger things, about the past that had shaped them, about the uncertainties of the future. Nahili told him more about her banishment. It wasn't just the scarring, it was the fact that the scarring had happened just before a terrible sickness had swept through her band, killing many. The elders, steeped in fear and superstition, had declared her a bad omen, her mark a sign of divine disfavor. She had been forced to leave, alone, given nothing but a few supplies and the understanding that she was never to return. The pain of that rejection, the loss of her family and community, was a deep wound that paralleled Thomas's own grief. They understood each other's quiet sorrow in a way no one else could. Thomas, in turn, spoke more about Sarah. Not the pain of her loss, not always, but the small, everyday details of their life together, the things he had kept locked away. Nahili listened patiently, her presence, a quiet comfort, a gentle balm on old wounds. He discovered that talking about Sarah didn't diminish her memory. It allowed him to share her, to keep her alive in a new way, and it allowed him to connect with Nahili on a deeper level, sharing the landscape of his heart. Nahili's arm healed, slowly but surely. The splint came off, and she began to use it normally, the stiffness gradually fading. Her leg wound closed cleanly. She was strong again, physically, but her spirit had been strengthened too, by Thomas's protection, by the simple fact of being accepted, scars and all. She never spoke of leaving, Thomas never asked her to. It became an unspoken agreement, a silent commitment. His lonely ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs. They built a small, functional life together, two solitary souls intertwined by fate and choice. The work was still hard, the land still demanding, but facing it together made it bearable, sometimes even good. They expanded the small garden near the cabin, Nahili teaching Thomas about plants he had previously ignored. They worked side by side, their movements easy and synchronized. They sat together in the evenings, sometimes by the fire, sometimes on the small porch, watching the stars ignite the vast, dark sky, a silent understanding flowing between them. The threat from Brody and the town didn't disappear entirely. There were other unwelcome visitors, men who rode by slowly, watching the ranch, their eyes filled with suspicion and disapproval. But they didn't dare another direct confrontation after the first. Thomas was ready for them, and the silent, watchful woman by his side was a clear signal that he was not alone. Their defiance was quiet but firm, a statement made not with words, but with their continued presence together on the land. People talked, of course. Rumors drifted across the miles, distorted and ugly, the grieving widower gone strange, living with a marked Apache woman. They were judged, ostracized by the narrow-minded world outside their ranch boundaries. But inside the cabin, on the windswept prairie that was now their shared home, those judgments lost their power. They had found a belonging that transcended the arbitrary rules of society. Their connection wasn't the passionate fire of young love, but something deeper, quieter, forged in shared pain and resilience. It was the steady warmth of two souls finding solace and strength in each other's presence. It was the comfort of knowing you were no longer facing the world, and the vast, empty loneliness, alone. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the wind whispering its constant song, Nahili leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a small gesture, tentative, but loaded with meaning. Thomas didn't move, simply rested his hand lightly on her arm. They sat like that for a long time, watching the light fade, the first stars appearing overhead. The silence was perfect, full not of absence but of presence. Grief was still there, a part of the ground beneath them, but it no longer defined the landscape. Hope had begun to grow, small and tenacious, like a desert flower pushing through cracked earth. They were two outcasts, a grieving cowboy and a banished Apache woman, who had ridden into each other's lonely lives and found a place to finally stay, together. The wind still blew, but now it carried the sound of two heartbeats instead of one. The house, once a lonely shell, held the quiet warmth of a shared life. They had defied banishment and prejudice, not with loud declarations, but with the simple, profound act of choosing to belong to each other. In the heart of the harsh frontier, they had found not just survival, but a quiet, hard-earned peace and a love that was strong enough to weather any storm the world might send their way. Their story was etched not in history books, but in the lines of their faces, the strength of their joined hands, and the silent promise of tomorrows faced side by side. Back in the harsh winter of 1878, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, covered in a shroud of unforgiving white that stretched from horizon to horizon. Snow lay heavy on the skeletal branches of trees, muffling sound, making the world a vast, silent, desolate place. The wind, a constant, biting presence, whipped across the high plains, scouring the frozen ground and seeking out any weakness. It howled like a thing grieving, a fitting soundtrack to the fate of Hannah, left alone against its fury. She lay huddled beneath a shallow overhang of rock, the meager shelter doing little to stave off the penetrating cold. Her coat, thin and ripped, offered scant protection. The snow had drifted around her, beginning to bury her where she lay. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps, tiny clouds that dissipated instantly in the frigid air. Each breath was a victory, a desperate refusal to surrender to the icy grip tightening around her. They had left her here, just hours ago, though it felt like an eternity measured in suffering. The men who had promised passage, who had seemed so friendly back in Fort Worth. They had taken her few possessions, taken the money she had saved for years, and then, when she became inconvenient, when she protested, they had simply thrown her from the wagon miles from anywhere and ridden away, left her to freeze, left her for dead. Hannah was barely 20 years old. Orphaned young, she had worked tirelessly in a dusty Texas town, cleaning, sewing, saving every cent for a chance at a new life further west, where the promise of land and a fresh start beckoned. She had trusted the wrong faces, followed the wrong path, and now her dreams were freezing solid around her. Loneliness was a palpable thing, a cold, heavy weight pressed against her chest. Not just the loneliness of being abandoned, but the profound, aching solitude of facing her own end in a world that seemed indifferent. There was no sound but the wind, no sight but the endless white, no hope but the faint, flickering ember of her own will. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to conjure the memory of warmth, of a kind face, of anything that wasn't this brutal, crushing cold. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the deepening ache in her bones and the creeping numbness that threatened to steal her consciousness. She was fading, she knew. The fight was leaving her. It was hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to care anymore. Surrender felt like a warm blanket, a release from the pain. Then a sound, or maybe she imagined it. A rhythmic thud against the snow, distinct from the wind. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the glare of the white landscape. Nothing. Just the snow, the rocks, the empty, endless sky. She closed her eyes again. The sound returned, closer now, hoofbeats. Slow, steady, approaching. Not the hurried retreat of the men who had left her. Curiosity, a weak tendril of something besides despair, pulled at her. She lifted her head, her muscles screaming in protest. Emerging from the swirling snow was a horse, dark against the white, and on its back, a man. He was lean, his face weathered, wrapped in layers of buckskin and wool. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, but she saw dark, sharp eyes scanning the terrain. He wasn't dressed like the settlers she knew. His features were angular, strong. He was Navajo. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness. Stories she had heard, whispers in town about savages, about danger in the wilderness. She had been warned. But then, they had left her here, the civilized men, and this man, this stranger, was the only living soul she had seen in what felt like days. He stopped his horse a distance away, his gaze fixed on the small, still shape huddled beneath the rock. Hannah couldn't move, could barely lift a hand. She simply watched him, her heart pounding a weak, frantic rhythm against her ribs. He dismounted, moving with a quiet economy of motion. He didn't rush. He approached slowly, his eyes never leaving her. Hannah braced herself, not knowing what to expect. More cruelty? Indifference? He stopped several feet away, assessing her with those dark eyes. His face was unreadable, etched with the lines of exposure and resilience. He looked from her to the tracks partially obscured by the drifting snow, the wagon tracks, the boot prints where they had dragged her. He saw, Hannah knew what had happened. He didn't speak, he simply stood there, a silent, imposing figure against the backdrop of the storm. Hannah shivered violently, a tremor that shook her whole body. It wasn't just the cold anymore. After a long moment he crouched down, his movements fluid. He didn't touch her. He reached out a gloved hand, not to her, but to the snow near her head. He scooped a handful, felt its texture, then looked back at her. His gaze was steady, neither hostile nor overtly kind, simply observing. Hannah found her voice, a raw, cracked whisper. "Please," she managed, the word thin and weak against the wind. He tilted his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement. Then, still without speaking, he stood up. Hannah's heart sank. He was leaving. He had seen, assessed, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. It was the final, crushing blow. But he didn't walk back to his horse. He turned, his back briefly to the wind, and surveyed the small overhang. He looked at the depth of the snow, the angle of the rock. He seemed to be measuring something, calculating. Then he began to move purposefully. He went to his horse, took a shovel, a proper one, not a flimsy thing, from its saddlebag. He returned to the overhang and, with strong, rhythmic strokes, began to clear the snow. He dug down, deepening the hollow beneath the rock, creating a space more protected from the wind. He worked steadily, efficiently, his breath misting in the air but his movements showing no sign of strain. Hannah watched him, bewildered. He wasn't leaving, he was helping. The fear was still there, a dull ache beneath her surprise, but it was overlaid with a fragile, unbelievable thread of hope. He finished clearing the space, making it large enough for her to lie down fully, shielded from the direct blast of the wind. Then he returned to his horse again. This time, he brought back a heavy, folded blanket. Not a saddle blanket, but a thick, woven wool blanket, the kind that held warmth like a promise. He knelt beside her, still not quite touching her. He unfolded the blanket. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble, quiet but clear, carrying a hint of accent she couldn't place. It was the first word he had spoken. Hannah hesitated, fear flickering again. He saw it. His expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that might have been patience, or perhaps just weary understanding. He didn't push the blanket on her. He simply held it out. Weakly, her fingers numb, she reached for it. The wool was rough against her skin, but it felt impossibly heavy, impossibly real. She pulled it towards her, fumbling with the folds. He watched her struggle for a moment. Then, carefully, without being abrupt, he reached out and helped her wrap it around herself. His touch was firm, deliberate, but not unkind. He tucked the edges around her, making sure she was covered from head to foot. The immediate rush of warmth was almost painful. She burrowed deeper into the wool, a small sigh escaping her lips. He still knelt there, watching. He reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled out a small, leather-wrapped bundle. He opened it to reveal dried meat and what looked like pounded berries mixed with fat. He offered a small piece to her. "Eat," he said. Hannah shook her head weakly. Her mouth was dry, her stomach cramped with cold and fear. He didn't insist. He simply placed the bundle within reach, near her hand. Then he rose. He went back to his horse, unsaddled it, and set about making a small, efficient camp near the overhang. He wasn't staying with her, not right beside her, but close enough that she wasn't alone. He built a small fire, sheltering it from the wind with a few stones he found nearby. The smoke curled thin and white against the gray sky. Hannah watched him through slitted eyes, wrapped in the blessed warmth of the blanket. He moved with a quiet competence, tending to his horse, checking his gear. He didn't look at her constantly, but she felt the weight of his presence, a silent watchfulness. As the fire took hold, casting a small, flickering circle of light and warmth, he sat beside it, facing outwards, his back to her. He seemed to be listening to the wind, to the silence. He was a sentinel, a protector. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he had stopped, why he hadn't left her to her fate. He owed her nothing, yet here he was. The man they called savage had offered her life when civilized men had offered her death. The irony was a bitter taste in her frozen mouth. Over the next few days, the snow continued to fall, sometimes heavily, sometimes a fine, persistent powder. The wind seldom ceased its mournful cry. Hannah remained huddled under the overhang, slowly regaining strength. Her rescuer, she thought of him that way now. Though she didn't dare speak the word aloud, remained a quiet, constant presence. He brought her small amounts of food and melted snow for water. He spoke little, his words functional. "Drink. Eat this. Stay warm." Hannah, too, spoke little. Fear still lingered, an instinct carved deep by her recent trauma and the prejudices she had absorbed. But alongside it grew a profound gratitude. She watched him. She saw the care he took with his horse, the way he replenished the small fire, always shielding it, making it last. She saw the lines of worry around his eyes when the weather worsened, not just for himself, she suspected, but for her. One evening, as the last sliver of bruised light faded from the sky, he sat by the fire, a silent silhouette. Hannah, feeling a little stronger, managed to sit up. "Why?" she whispered, her voice still weak. He turned his head slowly, his eyes catching the firelight. "Why what? Why? Why did you help me?" He looked back at the fire, poked it gently with a stick. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind filled the silence. "It is not right," he said finally, his voice low. "To leave someone like that, in the cold, alone." "But I'm white," she said, the words feeling foolish and small as soon as they were out. The prejudice was so ingrained. He turned his head again, his gaze level. "You are a person," he said simply. "A person left for dead. The snow does not care about the color of your skin." His honesty, his simple humanity, felt like a physical blow. It shattered some of the hardened shell she had built around herself, some of the fear and ingrained judgment. He saw her not as a category, but as a human being in need. "Thank you," she managed, tears unexpectedly stinging her eyes. "Thank you." He gave a short nod, acknowledging her words. He didn't offer comfort, didn't move towards her. It wasn't his way. But the silence between them shifted, becoming less tense, more shared. Days turned into a week. Hannah regained more strength. She could walk short distances now, stiffly, her muscles protesting, but walk. She helped gather small amounts of dried brush for the fire, a small gesture of contribution. He didn't ask her to, but he didn't stop her. They began to talk a little more, sparse conversations, functional at first, then slowly, hesitantly, venturing into personal territory. His name, he told her, was Takakota. He was from the Navajo Nation, traveling. He didn't offer details, and she didn't press. She told him a little about her journey, the dreams that had brought her west, the betrayal. She spoke carefully, wary of burdening him, but the words, once released, flowed with a quiet intensity. Takakota listened, his gaze steady, his presence grounding. He didn't offer platitudes or easy sympathy, but his silence was a form of profound understanding. He had seen hardship, she knew, probably more than she could imagine. They learned to exist alongside each other, in a quiet rhythm. The vast, empty landscape and the relentless cold were their shared reality, the forces that had brought them together and now bound them in a fragile alliance. They were two souls adrift in a wide ocean, finding a small island of shared existence. Takakota taught her small things, how to read the subtle shifts in the wind, what animal tracks meant in the snow, how to conserve warmth. He didn't teach her in a formal way, but through quiet example and brief, pointed observations. Hannah, who had always relied on the structures of town life, found herself learning a different kind of resilience, one rooted in observation, patience, and a deep respect for the natural world. Her fear of him dissipated, replaced by respect and a dawning sense of trust she hadn't felt for anyone in a very long time. His quiet strength was a comfort, his presence a shield against the terrifying loneliness she had felt. One morning, Takakota announced they would move. The weather was easing, the heaviest of the snowfall passed, though the cold remained brutal. They couldn't stay indefinitely. He had to continue his journey, and she, though she had no idea where she was going, couldn't remain under the rock forever. He helped her prepare for the journey. He fashioned her a warmer cloak from some spare material he had, showing surprising skill with a needle and thread. He found her sturdy, albeit worn, boots among the meager belongings the men had left behind. He packed carefully, efficiently. Getting onto the horse behind Takakota felt awkward, alien. She had never ridden double before. His back was a solid wall in front of her, radiating warmth. She kept a respectful distance at first, holding onto the back of the saddle. They rode through the silent, snow-laden landscape. The beauty was stark, breathtaking, and terrifying. The vastness of it made her feel tiny, insignificant. But riding with Takakota, she wasn't entirely alone. His quiet competence navigating the terrain was reassuring. They traveled for several days. Takakota seemed to know the land intimately, guiding them through passes and along ridges Hannah would never have found on her own. He hunted small game, supplementing their dried provisions. He made camp each night, the small fire, a beacon in the immense darkness. Their conversations continued, slowly deepening. She learned a little about his people, their connection to the land, their traditions. He learned about her longing for a home, a place to belong, the pain of her past losses. They shared vulnerabilities, not through dramatic confessions, but in quiet, shared moments under the vast, star-filled sky. One evening, huddled by the fire, Hannah shivered despite the blankets. Takakota noticed. Without a word, he shifted closer, offering his own warmth. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was a comfort more profound than any words could have been. Hannah leaned her head back against the rock, closing her eyes, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. She was still lost, still had nothing, but she wasn't alone. Their journey was not without peril. One afternoon, riding through a narrow canyon, they heard the sound of riders approaching from behind. Takakota immediately pulled his horse behind a cluster of rocks, signaling Hannah to be silent. Through a gap in the rocks, Hannah saw them. 4 men, rough-looking, armed. They were the men who had left her for dead. Her blood ran cold. They rode past the canyon entrance, heading in the same direction as Takakota had been going. They didn't see the hidden horse or the 2 figures crouched low. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. Takakota waited until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. His face was grim. He looked back at Hannah, his eyes sharp with concern. "They seek something," he said, his voice low. "Or someone." He didn't need to say who. Fear coiled in Hannah's stomach. They knew she was alive, or perhaps they were coming back to make sure the job was finished. Or maybe they were simply heading to the nearest town, where she would eventually need to go. "We cannot go that way," Hannah whispered. Takakota nodded. "There are other ways, harder ways." He didn't hesitate. He turned the horse and led them up a steep, challenging slope away from the canyon. The going was slow, treacherous in the snow. They had to dismount and lead the horse part of the way, scrambling over icy rocks. The physical exertion was immense, but the shared challenge, the silent cooperation required to navigate the difficult terrain, solidified something between them. Hannah, no longer the helpless victim, pushed herself, finding reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Takakota watched her, a flicker of something akin to approval in his eyes. They spent that night in a small cave high on the mountain, colder and less comfortable than their previous camps, but safe. The encounter with the men had heightened the tension, bringing the reality of the danger Hannah faced back into sharp focus. Sitting by the fire, the air thin and cold even indoors, Hannah finally voiced the question that had been hanging between them. "If they find me, they won't just hurt me." She looked at Takakota. "They will hurt you too, for helping me." Prejudice wasn't just an abstract concept out here, it was a tangible threat. Men like those, they wouldn't hesitate to turn their violence on a native man, especially one who had interfered with their plans, helped a white woman they had discarded. Takakota met her gaze. His face was calm, resolute. "Then we will not be found," he said. "But what happens when we reach somewhere, a town?" Hannah pressed. "People. They don't like to see a white woman with. She trailed off, unable to say the word Indian. The ingrained prejudice still a thorny vine in her mind. Takakota understood. He had faced it his whole life. "Some people see only what they expect to see," he said quietly. "Others see what is truly there." He looked at her, a deep, knowing look. "You must decide which eyes you will see with." His words were a challenge, a gentle push. He wasn't just protecting her physically, he was challenging her to shed the fear and prejudice that had held her captive in different ways. The journey continued, longer and harder now, looping away from the more traveled paths. The landscape remained a character in their story, vast and indifferent, testing their endurance, pushing them closer together in their shared vulnerability against its power. They came across a small abandoned line cabin after nearly 2 weeks of travel. It was dilapidated, half buried in snow, but it offered more substantial shelter than the overhangs and caves they had used. It felt, to Hannah, like a mansion. They worked together to make it habitable. Takakota repaired the broken door, patched holes in the roof, cleared the snow from around the walls. Hannah swept the dust and debris, found a rusted stove and cleaned it as best she could. They gathered firewood, a painstaking process in the deep snow. The cabin became their refuge, small, drafty, but a place of their own, however temporary. They ate their meager meals by the fire, the small space feeling less lonely than the vast outdoors. The silence here was different, not empty and menacing, but quiet and shared. One evening, after a day of back-breaking work, They sat by the stove. Hannah watched Takakota across the small space. He was repairing a torn seam on his buckskin jacket with careful stitches. His profile was sharp against the dim light, his hands deft and strong. "You have saved my life," Hannah said, the words simple and true. He didn't look up from his work. "We helped each other survive," he corrected quietly. "The land is hard." "Still," she insisted, "those men, you didn't have to stop." He finished his stitch, tied off the thread. He looked at her then, his eyes steady in the firelight. "A debt," he said. Hannah was confused. "A debt? To whom?" "To the balance," he replied, his voice low. It wasn't an explanation she fully understood, but she sensed it was deeply meaningful to him. A spiritual obligation, perhaps, to set right an imbalance he had witnessed. In the days that followed, a different kind of rhythm settled over them. They were no longer just surviving, they were existing together in this small cabin. They spoke more freely now, the initial barriers of fear and mistrust long gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. Hannah learned about the long walk, the forced removal of the Navajo people from their homeland, the suffering, the resilience. Takakota spoke of his family, lost to disease and hardship, of his journey alone, seeking, he didn't say what. But Hannah suspected he was seeking a place, a purpose, a sense of belonging too. He learned about her family, gone to sickness, her years of scraping by, her desperate hope for a new life. He saw the deep well of sadness she carried, the fear that still lurked beneath the surface. But he also saw her quiet strength, her determination, the way she tried to make the desolate cabin feel like a home. They were two broken pieces, fitting together in the vast, empty puzzle of the winter landscape. Their differences seemed insignificant now compared to the shared experience of vulnerability, betrayal, and the resilience that had kept them alive. As the harsh winter began its slow retreat, the snow lessening, the days growing fractionally longer, the issue of their future became unavoidable. They couldn't stay in the abandoned cabin forever. "Where will you go?" Hannah asked one evening, the question heavy with unspoken implications. Takakota was quiet for a time. "I don't know," he admitted, a rare moment of uncertainty in his usually self-possessed demeanor. "There is not much left for me here." He gestured vaguely towards the east, the direction of the reservations, of the land his people had been forced onto, and from which he seemed to be a part. "And you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. Hannah looked around the small cabin. It was rough, bare, but they had made it safe, made it theirs, in a way. She thought of the dusty town she had come from, the hard work, the lack of kindness. She thought of the men who had left her for dead, a chilling reminder of the world out there. She looked at Takakota, sitting across from her, his face familiar and dear in the firelight. "I don't know either," she said softly. "My dream. It was just for a place to be safe, where I wasn't alone." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions. They were two people from different worlds, brought together by violence and circumstance, finding solace and strength in each other. They had built a fragile bridge of trust across a chasm of prejudice and fear. Takakota rose, walked to the small single window. He looked out at the gray landscape, the distant snow-capped peaks. Hannah watched him, her heart aching with a mix of fear and something else she couldn't quite name, a fierce, protective feeling for this quiet, capable man who had saved her. He turned back to face her. His expression was serious. "The world outside, it is still hard," he said. "It will not be easy." "I know," Hannah replied. She thought of the judging eyes, the whispers, the open hostility they might face if they were seen together, especially if they went to a white settlement. "But," Takakota continued, his gaze holding hers, "we faced the cold, we faced the storm, we faced—" He didn't name the men, but she understood. "And we are still here." He walked slowly across the floor, stopping in front of her. He knelt down, something he rarely did. He reached out a hand, his strong fingers hesitant for a moment, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was light, tender, sending a tremor through her. "Perhaps," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "this place is a place to begin again." He wasn't talking just about the cabin. He was talking about the life they had found, together, here in the wilderness. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief, and a fragile, overwhelming joy, a place to begin again, with him. The man who had seen past her circumstances, past the color of her skin, and seen only a person in need, the man who had offered kindness when others offered cruelty. She reached out her hand and covered his, pressing it against her cheek. His skin was warm, rough from work and exposure, but so very real, so very alive. "Yes," she whispered, the word thick with emotion. "Yes, here." They stayed in the cabin as the snow slowly melted, the land gradually shedding its white mantle. They worked on the cabin, making it more secure, more like a home. They hunted and gathered, relying on Takakota's knowledge of the land. They spoke of their hopes, tentative, fragile things, but spoken aloud, they began to feel possible. They knew the challenges they would face. The world outside was full of judgment, fear, and hatred for those who were different. They knew their connection would be questioned, condemned by many. But they had faced death in the biting cold and survived. They had found connection in the deepest isolation. They had seen the worst of humanity and found unexpected kindness in the most unlikely place. They weren't defined by the past that had broken them, but by the resilience that had seen them through and the unexpected bond that had healed them. They had built a sanctuary not just in the cabin, but in the space between them, a place of mutual respect, quiet understanding, and a love that had bloomed in the harshest of winters. The spring came eventually, tentatively greening the landscape. The world outside the cabin was still vast, still challenging, but it no longer felt indifferent. It felt like a world they could face, together. They had been left for dead, found by a stranger, and in the finding, they had found something infinitely precious, a home in each other. They had survived the cold, and now they could begin to live.